The Revenge of the Wizard's Ghost by John Bellairs, Chapter 4. Johnny had been saved. He had to stay in the hospital a few days longer while the doctors checked him over. But after that he went home. He seemed to be in great shape. His eyes were clear, and the awful red marks were gone from his neck and nose. His heart was beating at the proper speed, and his temperature was normal. There was great rejoicing on Fillmore Street when Johnny arrived. The Dixons' parlor was full of bouquets of flowers that had been sent by his high school teachers. And there were get-well cards from everybody who knew him. Father Higgins stopped by to see how he was, and so did Professor Coote, who had driven all the way from New Hampshire to see his favorite bookworm. And the professor threw a big welcome-home party for Johnny with punch and Halloween candies and a big cake with orange and black icing. For the moment, everything seemed fine, and Johnny's only problem was people who kept asking him questions like, "Are you sure you really feel all right?" After a couple of days at home, Johnny went back to school, and the uproar over his recovery began to die down. Everything seemed to be returning to normal. Everything seemed fine, or did it? One person was not at all satisfied, and that was Professor Childermass. He could not believe that the ghost of Warren Windrow had left Johnny's body for good. Why had the ghost left? It didn't make any sense. Exorcism hadn't worked. They hadn't even been able to get near Johnny with the silver crucifix. The ghost had been cold, merciless, and cruel, not the sort of creature from whom you would expect compassion. So the professor was still nervous and watchful. He started reading books about ghosts. The more he read, the more he thought. And one night he called up Professor Coote to ask him to research everything he could find out about the Windrow family. After all, he said, they were a family of wizards and witches, and maybe one of them left behind some talisman or amulet that could help us if that evil creature decides to return. "Well, Roderick," said Professor Coote wearily, "I'll poke about in libraries and graveyards and family records and see what I can discover. But do you really think that all this worrying is necessary? What makes you think the ghost is planning another attack?" The professor was silent a moment. "I don't really know why I'm worried, Charlie," he said at last. "It's just instinct, I guess. Have you ever seen a cat playing with a mouse before he kills it? He lets it think it might escape, and then, just as the poor thing imagines that it's in the clear, whammo! The cat pounces and tears the mouse to bits, and that, my dear friend, is the sort of thing I'm worried about. The ghost might think it was great sport to let Johnny go for a while." "Heaven help us," said Professor Coote in a worried voice. "I hope you're wrong." "So do I," said his friend. "So do I." November was a rainy, windy month. Johnny was back in his usual everyday routine. Nothing bad seemed to be happening to him, but he felt strange because he could not figure out why he had landed in the hospital. No one would tell him anything. The professor would only say that he had been through a bad time, and Grandma and Grandpa were strangely silent too. Johnny could remember some of the frightening dreams that he had had, but there were big gaps in his memory. For instance, he could not remember anything that had happened to him on the night that he went to the card party at the professor's house. And there was another odd thing. The day after he got home from the hospital, Father Higgins showed up at his house and gave him the silver cross to wear. He told Johnny to put the chain around his neck and wear it all the time, even in bed at night and in the bathtub. When Johnny asked why, Father Higgins clammed up. So Johnny wore the cross, but one day he found that the clasp on the chain was irritating his neck. He tried to take the chain off, and the clasp broke. Johnny stuffed the cross and chain into a vase on his bureau, and he promised himself that he would get the clasp fixed right away. In the meantime, he'd just have to take his chances with whatever bad luck happened to come his way. One gusty cold night, Johnny was walking home from Fergie's house. At the start of the walk, he was in a pretty good mood because he had beaten Fergie in 3 straight games of chess. But as he walked on, he found that he was getting jittery. It was so windy that a few dead branches came clattering down near Johnny, and sometimes a very strong gust would knock over a garbage can in the alley. The endless moaning in the trees was not very pleasant either. By the time he got to the end of Fillmore Street, Johnny was jumping at every sound that he heard. He glanced ahead and saw the windows glowing in his grandparents' house, and as always, the sight made him feel good. He started walking faster, but he came to a sudden halt when he heard a scraping noise off to his right. Something was moving toward him. Johnny jumped. Then he looked and heaved a sigh of relief. It was just a paper plate sliding across the street. Or was it? As Johnny stood watching, the plate scuttled closer, and he saw that it was not a plate at all. It was a mask. Was it a Halloween mask that some kid had thrown away? No, it did not seem to be that kind of mask. It was completely white, and there were no eye holes or mouth hole. The mask looked like a plaster cast that had been made of somebody's face. Somebody's dead face. It was the face of a young man with a scar across his nose and a sneering, brutal mouth. A cold breath blew over Johnny's body. Where had he seen the face before? Dim memories of an old photograph flashed through his mind, and horror began to creep through him. He edged away from the ghastly thing and started to run, but he didn't stop till he was in the front hall with the door closed behind him. The next day, on his way to school, Johnny searched in the gutter and in the front yards near his house, but he did not find the mask. "Forget about it," he said to himself as he marched off to school, but that was easier said than done. It was a long time before he could get the pale, ugly mask out of his mind. Months passed, and Johnny went on feeling fine. He passed his first semester exams easily, and did a term paper on Julius Caesar that got him an A+ in his Latin class. In the middle of January, he learned how to skate. Johnny had always been scared of ice skating. He told himself that he had weak ankles and a poor sense of balance. But the truth was that he was just plain afraid. Fergie told Johnny he was crazy to just stand around all winter with his hands in his pockets watching other people have fun. So as soon as Round Pond was solidly frozen over, Fergie dragged Johnny down there and taught him to skate. It wasn't easy. Johnny fell down a lot at first, and sometimes when he came limping home after a skating session, his body felt like one big bruise. Gradually, though, he learned to keep his balance, and after 2 weeks he was flying along the ice to the delight and amazement of Fergie and the professor. The professor was an old skating buff, and he started kidding Johnny and challenging him to races. After going skating, the three of them would always wind up by the fireplace in the professor's house, and they would drink mulled cider and sing old football songs and tell jokes and roast marshmallows over the fire. The winter rolled past and spring came. One Saturday afternoon, early in April, Johnny and Fergie took a hike around the chain of ponds at the eastern end of Dunstan Heights. The two of them tramped for hours, laughing and singing and trading wisecracks. Around 6 in the evening, when the sun was setting, Johnny and Fergie stopped at the top of a hill to stare at the view. The reddish sunlight stained the ripply water of Spy Pond below them. On the far bank stood an old brick pumping station with its green copper turrets. Its windows had turned to blobs of golden fire. "Wow," said Fergie, as he looked all around with his hands on his hips. "It looks great from up here, doesn't it?" Johnny said nothing. They had been hiking for a long time, and he was a little out of breath. His face was red and felt faint. "Yeah, it's nice," he said at last in a weak, throaty voice, "but I'm starved. And I feel kind of dizzy. What's the shortest way home?" Fergie laughed. "Oh, come on, Dixon," he said in a jeering voice. "What are you going to do when they get you in the army? You'll have to hike 25 miles every morning before breakfast, and after that—" Fergie's voice trailed away. He had been talking with his back to Johnny, but he turned when he heard a thud. It was the sound of a body falling. Horrified, Fergie looked down and saw his friend lying in a heap on the trail. And that's the end of Chapter 4.